A century ago, the world stood on the brink of a revolution it barely understood. It was only 17 years since the Wright brothers had proven human flight was possible, yet already, brave men and women were climbing into fragile contraptions of canvas and pine. They were trusting their lives to machines that seemed to defy nature itself. The 1920s were an age of breathtaking ambition and staggering recklessness. Cars were replacing horses, radio waves were carrying voices across oceans, and in the skies above America, a new breed of pioneer was being born. These were pilots who flew through storms without instruments, passengers who wrote farewell letters before boarding, and engineers who learned the laws of aerodynamics through the bodies of the fallen. What you are about to hear is not fiction. These are the true stories of early aviation, stories of courage that bordered on madness, of progress paid for in blood, and of a nation that looked up at the heavens and decided that no price was too high to conquer them. In the 1920s, every single flight was an act of faith, and for many, it was also a final act. But before we begin, please take a moment to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. In 1980, the United States government launched an ambitious experiment, the U.S. Air Mail Service. The idea was simple: use airplanes to carry letters across vast distances in a fraction of the time it took trains or trucks. But what seemed like a straightforward postal innovation quickly became one of the deadliest jobs in America. Over the course of the 1920s, approximately 200 pilots flew for the airmail service. By 1926, 34 of them were dead. That is a mortality rate of nearly 1 in 6 odds that would make even the bravest soldier hesitate. The pilots themselves understood exactly what they had signed up for. They called themselves the Suicide Club, and they meant it. The conditions these men faced were almost unimaginable by modern standards. They flew in open cockpits, completely exposed to the elements. Rain, snow, hail, and freezing winds battered them for hours at a time. Temperatures at altitude could plunge far below zero, numbing fingers and faces until frostbite became an occupational hazard. There were no reliable navigation instruments, no radar, no GPS, nothing but a compass that spun wildly near metal and a map that was often useless in bad weather. Pilots navigated by following railroad tracks and highways, flying low enough to read the names painted on water towers. When clouds rolled in, they were blind. Night flights were particularly deadly, yet the pressure to deliver mail on schedule pushed pilots into the darkness regardless. In 1921, a pilot named Jack Knight made aviation history by flying 830 miles through the night, guided only by bonfires that farmers had lit along his route. He landed safely, but many of his colleagues were not so fortunate. When a pilot died, his fellow airmen would gather, raise a silent toast, and return to their aircraft the next morning. There were no replacements waiting. There was only the mail, the machine, and the sky. Among those who survived the Suicide Club was a young man named Charles Lindbergh. Before he became the most famous aviator in the world, Lindbergh flew mail routes across the Midwest. He survived for emergency parachute jumps from failing aircraft. 4 times, his plane failed him. 4 times, he fell through the sky and lived to fly again. He was one of the lucky ones. The first commercial airline passengers were not pampered travelers reclining in cushioned seats. They were adventurers, or perhaps simply the desperate, who climbed into open cockpits and semi-enclosed cabins that offered almost no protection from the brutal realities of heel-toot flight. In the 1920s, there were no pressurized cabins, no climate control systems, no sound insulation. There was only the roaring engine, the howling wind, and the bone-deep cold of the upper atmosphere. At cruising altitude, temperatures could plunge to 20 degrees below 0 Celsius, even in summer. Passengers were issued goggles, leather helmets, heavy gloves, and fur-lined blankets. They dressed as if they were preparing to cross Antarctica, not fly from one city to another. The noise was so overwhelming that conversation was impossible. Passengers sat in silence. Shouting would not have helped. Clutching their blankets and praying that the shaking, rattling contraption around them would hold together for just a few more miles. Above 10,000 feet, the thin air brought dizziness, nausea, and shortness of breath. Many passengers became physically ill, and there were no air sickness bags, no flight attendants, no amenities of any kind. Those who needed to vomit simply leaned over the side of the aircraft and let the wind carry it away. A journey from New York to Los Angeles, a flight that takes approximately 5 hours today, required 2 to 3 days in 1920. The aircraft could not fly through the night without ground support, and their limited range demanded constant refueling stops. Passengers disembarked at dusty airfields, waited for mechanics to service the engine, and then climbed back aboard to continue their ordeal. The smell inside these early aircraft was a nauseating mixture of burning oil, aviation fuel, and human sickness. Many passengers, before boarding, sat down and wrote letters to their families, final messages to be delivered in case they did not survive the journey. These were not paranoid individuals. They were simply realistic about the odds. Flying in 1920 meant accepting that you might not come home. When the First World War ended in 1918, thousands of military pilots suddenly found themselves without purpose. They had been trained to fly, trained to fight, trained to risk their lives in the skies over Europe. Now they were civilians with no jobs and no prospects, but with one remarkable skill that the public had never seen. The government, eager to dispose of surplus military equipment, sold off thousands of aircraft for astonishingly low prices. A Curtiss Jenny that had cost the army several $1,000s to build could be purchased for $200 to $500. Veterans bought them by the hundreds and invented a new profession. Barnstormers traveled from town to town, landing in farmers' fields and fairgrounds, putting on aerial shows for crowds who had never seen an airplane up close. They performed death-defying stunts, loops, rolls, dives, and spins that pushed their fragile aircraft to the breaking point. But simple acrobatics were not enough to draw paying audiences. The barnstormers needed spectacle. They needed danger that the crowd could see and feel, and so they invented wing walking. Men and women would climb out of the cockpit during flight, walk along the wings, hang from struts and landing gear, leap from one aircraft to another in midair. They would swoop down and snatch objects from the ground with their bare hands. They would fly beneath bridges with inches to spare. The crowds loved it. The newspapers covered it, and the death toll climbed relentlessly. The stories of those who died are too numerous to recount, but some stand out in the historical record. Ormond Leclerc was perhaps the most famous wing walker of his generation, a daredevil who had performed stunts for Hollywood films. In 1920, during a night filming session in Los Angeles, his aircraft dove into an oil field and exploded. He was killed instantly. Basie Coleman, the first African-American woman to earn a pilot's license, died in 1926 when she was thrown from an open cockpit during a test flight. She had not been wearing a seatbelt because she needed to lean over the side to plan a parachute jump for the following day's show. Lillian Boyer was one of the few who survived the era, performing over 350 wing-to-wing transfers before retiring. For every Lillian Boyer, there were dozens who were not so fortunate. By 1926, the death toll had become so severe that the federal government intervened. The Air Commerce Act of that year established the first regulations for American aviation, requiring pilot licensing and aircraft certification. The age of lawless skies was ending, but not before it had claimed hundreds of lives. Here's a fact that seems almost impossible to believe. In the 1920s, parachutes existed. They worked, and yet most pilots refused to use them. The technology had been proven during the war. Military aviators had jumped from burning aircraft and floated safely to Earth. The Irvine parachute, with its manual ripcord deployment system, was reliable and available. And still, commercial pilots and barnstormers alike climbed into their cockpits without any means of escape. The reasons were partly practical and partly psychological, and the consequences were measured in graves. The parachutes of this era were heavy and cumbersome, weighing approximately 20 pounds, and requiring the pilot to sit on a bulky pack for hours at a time in the cramped cockpits of 1920s aircraft. This was genuinely uncomfortable. But discomfort alone does not explain the resistance. There was a culture among pilots, particularly among the veterans who had flown in combat, that viewed parachutes as a sign of cowardice. A real pilot, the thinking went, could handle any emergency. A real pilot would never abandon his aircraft. A real pilot did not need a parachute because a real pilot did not crash. This machismo killed men who could have survived. Pilots who encountered engine failures or structural damage often attempted forced landings rather than jumping to safety. Sometimes they succeeded. More often, they did not. Passengers, meanwhile, were never given parachutes under any circumstances. The logistics were impossible. There was no time to train civilians in emergency procedures. No way to ensure that a panicking passenger would pull the ripcord at the correct altitude. No room in the aircraft to store a dozen bulky packs. If the plane went down, the passengers went down with it. There was no escape hatch, no emergency protocol, no final option. Charles Lindbergh was unusual in his insistence on always carrying a parachute, and his caution saved his life 4 times. After each emergency jump, he would dust himself off, report the loss of the aircraft, and return to flying. He understood what many of his colleagues refused to accept. In the skies of 1920, survival favored the prepared. By the middle of the 1920s, it had become clear that aviation could not continue as it had been. The death toll was unsustainable. The public was fascinated by flight, but terrified of flying. Something had to change, and in 1926, Henry Ford provided what seemed like an answer. The Ford Trimotor, affectionately nicknamed the Tin Goose, was one of the first aircraft with an all-metal construction. Its corrugated aluminum skin would not burn like fabric. Its rigid structure would not flex and fail like wood. It could carry up to 12 passengers in an enclosed cabin, protected from the wind and cold. It had 3 engines, meaning that it could theoretically continue flying even if one failed. The trimotor was not perfect. It was loud, it vibrated terribly, and it was expensive at $50,000 per aircraft. But it represented something revolutionary, the possibility that ordinary people could fly without writing farewell letters first. For a few years, it seemed that the promise of safe commercial aviation might finally be realized. Airlines began purchasing trimotors and their competitors. Passenger numbers increased. The public began to believe that the age of the flying coffin was ending. And then, on March 31st, 1931, a Fokker F-10, operated by Transcontinental and Western Air, fell out of the sky over Kansas. All 8 people aboard were killed, including one passenger whose death would shake the nation to its core. Knute Rockne, the legendary football coach of Notre Dame, one of the most famous and beloved figures in American sports. The investigation that followed revealed a horrifying truth. The Fokker F-10 had wooden wings covered in fabric, and moisture had seeped into the internal structure over months of service. The wood had rotted from the inside. The wing had simply failed. Separating from the aircraft in flight, there had been no warning, no emergency, no chance for survival. The aircraft had been inspected and certified as airworthy. The regulations that existed had not been sufficient to detect the decay. Rockne's death was a national tragedy, covered on front pages across the country. But it was also a turning point. The public outcry forced regulators to impose far stricter maintenance requirements. Aircraft with wooden structures began to be phased out of commercial service. The era of metal aircraft, safer, stronger, more reliable, had begun in earnest. It took a beloved coach's death to make Americans demand that flying be made safe. Perhaps the most unsettling truth about early aviation is this: the engineers who designed these aircraft did not fully understand how they worked. The science of aerodynamics was still in its infancy. The principles that allowed a wing to generate lift were known in general terms, but the specific calculations, the precise shapes, the optimal angles, the limits of structural stress, were often matters of guesswork and intuition. Pilots climbed into machines that were essentially experiments, hoping that the designer had guessed correctly. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the predecessor to NASA, had been founded in 1915 to study the science of flight. By the 1920s, it was conducting wind tunnel tests and publishing research papers. But the gap between laboratory knowledge and practical aircraft design remained vast. Engineers frequently copied the shapes of bird wings, without understanding the physics that made them work. They built prototypes based on intuition, tested them in flight, and learned from the crashes. The phenomena known as flutter, a destructive vibration that could tear wings apart in seconds, was poorly understood and impossible to predict. Aircraft that seemed perfectly stable would suddenly begin shaking themselves to pieces at certain speeds. Pilots had no warning and no recourse. Stalled, the loss of lift that occurs when a wing exceeds its critical angle, was another deadly mystery. Pilots were taught to keep the nose down and maintain airspeed, but the precise mechanics of stall recovery were not well documented. Many aircraft had unique handling characteristics that their designers had never fully mapped. The manuals, when they existed at all, were often just a few pages of basic instructions. Pilots learned to fly through trial and error, developing personal techniques that might or might not be correct. Training could be remarkably brief: a few hours of instruction, a handful of supervised flights, and then a solo journey into the sky. There were no simulators, no standardized curricula, no way to practice emergencies without actually experiencing them. Every flight was an education, and the tuition was sometimes paid in full. We live today in a world where air travel is safer than driving to the airport. Modern aircraft are engineered to withstand forces that would have seemed supernatural to the pilots of 1920. Cabins are pressurized, and climate navigation is managed by satellites and computers. Pilots trained for years in simulators that can replicate any conceivable emergency. We board airplanes without writing farewell letters. We fall asleep before takeoff and wake up in different time zones. We have forgotten what it meant to fly when flying was a form of courage. But we should not forget, the safety we take for granted today was purchased by the men and women who climbed into machines of wood and fabric, who flew through storms, without instruments, who died in burning wreckage so that investigators could learn what went wrong. Every regulation in the aviation code, every safety feature in a modern aircraft, every protocol that pilots follow, exists because someone, somewhere, did not come home. The 34 pilots of the airmail service who gave their lives, the hundreds of Barnster Moores who fell from the sky, the passengers who trusted in machines that were not ready to be trusted. Knute Rockne sitting in a Fokker F-10, that was rotting from within. They are the foundation upon which modern aviation stands. A century ago, to step aboard an airplane was to make a wager with death. The odds were not good, and everyone knew it. And yet, they flew. They flew because they believed in the future. They flew because they understood that progress demands sacrifice. They flew because the sky, for all its dangers, called to something deep within the human spirit. A need to rise, to explore, to transcend the limitations of the earthbound life. We are the inheritors of their courage. Every time we board a flight without fear, we are living in the world they died to create. If this journey through the terrifying skies of 1920 has moved you, if you find yourself wanting to know more about the forgotten chapters of history, then consider joining us on this channel. We explored the past, not to escape the present, but to understand how we arrived here and what it cost. Hit the subscribe button, leave a comment, sharing your thoughts, and help us continue bringing these stories to light. History is not just dates and names. History is people who lived, who struggled, who sometimes died, so that the future might be better than the past. If you want to keep exploring what life really felt like 100 years ago, I will leave a link in the first comment to an incredible ebook you can download. Until next time, remember, the world you live in was built by those who dared to imagine it first.